Hey, Halloween mask come early this year? Laughter erupted as Eliza Kincaid entered the mess hall. She didn't respond, didn't look, just quietly sat down as if accustomed to being torn apart daily by cruel words. But deep in her eyes was a storm that never ceased. No one here knew she had once run through a hail of bullets to save lives, had lain in a battlefield with her face ablaze. And now, among those who had never fired a real shot, she had to fight again. This time for her honor. And then, one person would force the entire unit to fall silent. With the truth. Before diving into a story that will keep you glued to the screen, I have a small favor to ask. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you love inspiring stories, and don't forget to leave a comment letting me know where are you watching from and what time is it where you live. It always feels amazing to see the whole world come together just to share a meaningful moment. On the southern edge of El Paso, where the border runs like a crack through life, people learn to live with hunger before mastering the alphabet. Eliza Kincaid grew up in a ramshackle house with cracked walls and a tin roof that rattled every time the southwest wind swept through. She knew food stamps before multiplication tables and learned to stretch a can of boxed macaroni across a whole day without complaint. The scarcity didn't make her sad, but it silenced her whenever she saw her mother hide a sigh behind a closed door. At 17, Eliza didn't go to prom, didn't receive a diploma, and had no farewell party for her school years. She signed her enlistment papers with a borrowed pen and a heart carrying a single resolve: determination. The military, for her, wasn't a dream of glory. It was an escape, a place where waking up each day had meaning, even if just for training or cleaning rifles. In her early years in the service, Eliza wasn't the best, but she was always the last to leave the training field. She observed quietly, learned quickly, and endured relentlessly. Her near-absolute discipline caught the attention of her superiors. From supply technician to close-range marksman, Eliza never turned down a tough assignment. She went from Paris Island's training camp to the arid wastes of Mogadishu, step by step, quietly leaving her mark like small but deep knife cuts on stone. In Syria, she learned to wait silently. In Yemen, she learned to hold her breath when comrades were wounded and bullets whistled overhead. But it was the outskirts of Maria, Afghanistan, that etched an indelible mark on her soul with a memory that could never fade. In her 14th year of service, Eliza led a mission to protect a humanitarian convoy carrying medicine and food. She didn't know that day would split her life in two. Her Humvee was leading the convoy when an explosion tore the ground beneath the second vehicle's wheels. A blinding white flash erupted, followed by the roar of hell. Eliza was thrown from the driver's seat, her body engulfed in smoke, oil, and fire. But amid the daze, instinct drove her to crawl back. With bare hands, she pulled two young soldiers and an Afghan interpreter from the burning wreckage. There was no time for thought, only action. When her body could no longer obey, she collapsed beside the debris, her hand still clutching the sleeve of one of those she'd saved. Eliza survived. But the cost wasn't just the scorched skin from her cheek to her neck. It was the fragmented memories of that day that kept creeping back in her sleep. The scar, stretching like hardened lava, was a testament to the pain and a witness to what she had done. Every morning in the mirror, she saw not just her changed face, but the lives that still existed because of her resolve in that life-or-death moment. The military offered her a commendation. She refused. "I just did what needed doing," Eliza said in her final report. But no one really asked her what was left of her after doing it. And the answer smoldered like a scar that never healed.
Welcome to Veteran Best Stories, where the war ends, but the stories live on. From the foxholes to front porches, we honor the silent battles our veterans still fight. Subscribe and walk with us beyond the battlefield.
2 years in the hospital were long enough to learn to endure pain, but not enough to learn to face the stares of others. Eliza Kincaid left the military with a thick record of valor, a blazing scar stretching from her left cheek to her jawline, and a heart steeped in silence. She didn't return to Texas. She didn't go anywhere. She chose to live in a small town near Camp Pendleton's training base, where the sound of gunfire was the only thing that steadied her trembling heart. Social media, old friends, even award ceremonies, she ignored them all. Any spotlight could illuminate the dark corners she didn't want anyone to see. Sleepless nights stretched endlessly. She often sat alone in her small apartment, back against the wall, eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if closing them would bring back the flames that had once consumed her. But one thing she couldn't deny: she still wanted to serve, not by fighting anymore, but by teaching younger soldiers how to survive. When the recruit training unit invited her back as a basic firearms instructor, Eliza nodded without much thought. Not for honor, but out of habit. The habit of standing in a training field with the smell of gunpowder, the clank of metal, and synchronized breaths. She thought she'd find her rhythm again in it. But no one told her that invisible scars are often more vulnerable than those on the surface. On her first day in the classroom, the first looks weren't of respect. They were scrutinizing. A new instructor, scarred face, no smile, no handshakes. Whispers started in the hallways, spread to the firing range, and took root in the break room. Half-face, Bernie, Ghost Girl, the nicknames floated in the air like stray bullets, each one slicing another invisible gash into Eliza's self-respect. She didn't respond. Not a glare, not a word of defense. She was as still as water before a storm, doing her job with chilling precision, correcting grip techniques, issuing clear safety commands, grading without bias. But the quieter she was, the further she was pushed from the group. At the center of the mocking wave was Captain Brian Lutz, young, pristine, always dressed impeccably as if posing for a military magazine. The son of a prominent senator, he was also the best at hiding malice behind polished smiles. "If she's teaching marksmanship, maybe I should teach models how to walk the catwalk," he quipped as she passed by. Laughter echoed behind her like stones thrown into a calm lake. Eliza kept walking, never looking back. She had grown so accustomed to silence that pain became a fixed part of her. But each burst of laughter, each stare fixed on her scar, reminded her of the nights she bandaged wounded soldiers with her own hands, of the days in Marja when there was no laughter, only blood and scorched earth. Lutz and his cronies didn't know that. They had never lain in a desert with bullets whistling past their ears. They had never seen a comrade's eyes fade in their arms. Eliza understood, and she didn't need to prove herself. Those who had walked through the gates of death didn't need to shout to be recognized. But no silence lasts forever. In Eliza's classroom, among the tough, guarded faces and wary glances, there was one small figure quieter than silence itself. Private Marisol Vega, 19, from a foster home in San Juan, was the least talkative in the platoon. Her voice carried the halting rhythm of someone who learned English from news broadcasts, and her eyes always seemed to apologize for her own presence. Her peers rarely noticed Vega, if they didn't outright ignore her, while others competed to boast about physical feats, technical skills, or connections. Vega sat quietly in a corner, shrinking herself as if trying to minimize her existence. She knew she didn't belong in that noisy world. She came here not to prove herself, but to escape a life forgotten. Eliza noticed her from the first day, not because Vega stood out, but because of how she listened. Amid the rowdy crowd, only Vega watched every instructional movement intently, as if each word carried weight. Eliza said nothing. She was used to being unacknowledged, no longer reaching out first. But those eyes, that gaze free of disdain or pity, only pure focus, left a quiet mark in her heart. One late afternoon, after class had ended and everyone had dispersed to the training field, Vega didn't leave right away. She lingered, holding a practice rifle not yet stored, her eyes raised as if wrestling with herself. Finally, a voice as soft as a breeze through a cracked door spoke. "Instructor Kincaid, does that scar? Does it hurt?" The question held no malice, nor curiosity, just concern, so raw it was startling. Eliza froze. It had been a long time since anyone asked her that, not with scrutiny or pity, but simply because they wanted to understand. She sat down slowly on a chair and nodded. "It used to hurt a lot," she said, letting emotion slip through her calm mask for the first time. But what made it bearable was knowing people survived because of it. Vega didn't ask more. She just lowered her head and quietly stored the rifle. But from that day, she began trailing Eliza like a shadow. In class, she always chose the closest spot, attentive like an old-school military cadet. She practiced controlling her breathing as instructed, rehearsed each trigger pull, each steady stance, with a patience that made even the best students take notice. Eliza didn't praise. She wasn't used to giving encouragement. But each time she adjusted Vega's grip or gently nudged her shoulder to align her stance, something shifted inside her. She started staying a bit longer after class, teaching Vega small tricks she'd used in combat, things not found in manuals. The girl learned quickly, but never rushed. That persistence reminded Eliza of herself at 17, when no one believed a poor girl from El Paso could survive the line between life and death. Vega didn't change the atmosphere of the entire training camp or stop the young officers' gossip, but she reminded Eliza of something vital, that her existence still held value, that silence wasn't invisibility, and that sometimes all it took to start healing was one person looking straight at you without turning away. 3 months later, as California's scorching summer still clung to every grain of sand on the training field, an urgent announcement crackled through the internal comms. A surprise inspection from Marine Corps Command. No one was forewarned. No one was prepared. The instructors buzzed with murmurs. Young officers fidgeted. But the seasoned ones, they stayed silent. Lieutenant General Marcus Delaney arrived in an unmarked Humvee. No flags, no entourage. 42 years in the Corps, he didn't need anyone to tell him who was a true officer and who was a polished facade. Stepping out, he scanned the surroundings with eyes accustomed to blood-soaked lands from Fallujah to Basra. His gaze sought nothing specific, but missed nothing. As he walked past the line of instructors standing at attention, those eyes paused, for a moment shorter than a breath, on a woman at the end of the line. No one else noticed. But in that glance, a fragment of memory stirred. A report. A rumor. A scar on a face once thought lost. There was no time for speculation. The inspection began. Instructors took turns demonstrating. Techniques precise, movements clean, but nothing truly stood out. Everything was by the book, like well-programmed machines. Then it was Eliza's turn. She stepped forward, offering no introduction. Her grip on the rifle was steady, her stance unassuming, yet each step carried a weight, as if the ground beneath remembered who trod upon it. The task was simple: demonstrate basic sniper shooting at 3 distances, 100, 400, and 800 meters. Straightforward. Potentially dull, if not for the person holding the rifle. Eliza's expression didn't change. The scar twitched faintly at her temple, an unconscious reflex when she focused. As the barrel aligned with the first target, all surrounding sounds seemed to dissolve into a void. The first shot, a crisp pop, and the bullet hit dead center with near zero deviation. The second shot, at 400 meters, was just as precise. But it was the third, at 800 meters, amidst hot gusts and subtle shifts in the sandy terrain, that made the entire field hold its breath. No one spoke. There was no need. Only the sound of the spent casing hitting the ground, rolling lightly, then stopping. General Delaney stepped forward from the observer's bench, his eyes free of doubt. He looked directly at the woman before him, as if confirming something long lost. Then he turned to the entire team, his voice low and warm, not loud, but enough to still the wind. She is the real deal, the one who saved 3 lives in Marja in 2016, the one I thought was dead. No one moved. And you? He scanned the crowd slowly, his gaze landing squarely on the young officers, the ones who had laughed behind Eliza's back. Dare call her Bernie? No one spoke. A few eyes dropped, a few hands clenched, not in anger, but in shame. Eliza said nothing. She stood still with the rifle at her side, as if no one had just spoken her name in that thick silence. But in that moment, something shifted, not because of the declaration, but because of the acknowledgement. And from that day, no one called her by the names they once thought were a joke. 3 days after the inspection, Captain Brian Lutz's office was as still as if it had never existed. No official announcement, no farewell gathering, not a single internal memo. When the young officers arrived on Monday morning, Lutz's desk was cleared, the chair empty and cold, a stark reminder that something profound had shifted. Rumors swirled about a special report requested by Lieutenant General Delaney the night he left the training camp. No one knew its contents, only that it led to a quiet transfer. And in that quiet, no one asked further. Eliza didn't rejoice. Nor did she show satisfaction. She simply continued walking to the training field as always, the practice rifle steady in her hand, her posture as upright as if the flames of the past had never touched her skin. She refused every offer of promotion, declined to take a unit command position. She didn't want the podium. She chose to stay below it, where dust and sweat forged real value. But the trainees had changed. They arrived on time without needing reminders. Eyes that once merely glanced at her now followed every movement of her hands. Words that once fell into silence were now carefully noted. And when she taught Vega how to control her breathing, each breath slow, steady, timed to the trigger pull, other recruits silently followed suit. No one said it aloud, but no one wanted to miss anything from the woman who had proven that sometimes silence speaks the loudest. Vega progressed quickly, not loudly, not smugly, just steadier each day, each shot more precise. Eliza saw it, not just in the results, but in the quiet focus of the girl's eyes. It was no longer the fearful gaze of a child left behind. It was the look of someone beginning to understand her own worth. Eliza's words, never spoken loudly, began to spread beyond the training field. Someone wrote on the break room whiteboard, "Always know your exit." A recruit whispered during shooting practice, "The trigger is a promise," another nodded. "Don't promise if you're not sure." No one credited her name to those words, but everyone knew who planted them, not through official slogans, but through the way she stood there, day after day, needing no medals, no applause, only the rifle in her hand and a gaze always fixed on the target. During one session, as the sun slanted through the trees lining the training field, Vega completed her shooting test with a perfect score. No applause erupted, no one shouted, but the glance she cast toward Eliza and the nod she received was the greatest reward. From then on, the classes that followed were no longer mere mandatory training. They became silent handovers, not just of skills, but of spirit. Every stance, every reminder, every step on the sand became a thread connecting young soldiers to something greater than themselves. And Eliza, who still walked back to her small apartment each night in silence, knew she didn't need the medal she once refused. Because honor, in the end, wasn't found in a piece of metal pinned to her chest. It was in the eyes of others when they realized they were learning from someone who had truly survived. On Vega's graduation day, the California sky stretched a strangely serene blue. In the small courtyard behind the training field, wooden chairs were neatly aligned, as orderly as the years each soldier would have to endure. No music, no lengthy speeches, just a simple ceremony, with each name called out and each pair of eyes waiting in anticipation. Vega stood at the top of the list, as if life had finally granted her a deserved place after years on the margins. When her name was announced, the applause wasn't loud, but it was sincere. She didn't look at the stands or the certificate in her hand. Her eyes turned only to the back, where Eliza Kincaid stood silently, hands clasped, as she always did, when watching her students cross a new milestone. After the ceremony, Vega didn't follow the crowd. She ran to Eliza and for the first time hugged her tightly. It wasn't the hug of a recruit thanking an instructor. but of a young person embracing someone who had taught her how to survive. No scripted words were needed, but what she whispered lingered in Eliza's heart. "I'll come back, and I'll teach like you taught me." That evening, in the small room as quiet as ever, Eliza walked to the wooden dresser by her bed. She opened the bottom drawer, a place no one had seen, one she herself had forgotten for years. Inside was an old wooden box, its faded brown worn by time. She lifted it with both hands, as if cradling a piece of unwashed memory. Inside was a photograph, so old its edges were frayed, the paper faded. 3 young soldiers smiled brightly beside her, a rare moment captured in the scorched lands of Marja. They were the ones who had seemed lost, but lived on through the years she silently carried them. She lit a candle, placed the photo beside it, and sat down. In the dim, flickering light, she whispered, not as a prayer, but as an affirmation, "I'm still here. I'm still fighting. Through others' hands." A week later, a letter arrived from the Department of Defense in a thick envelope, its red seal stark and solemn. Inside were a few brief lines signed by Delaney. He wrote, "If one day you want to claim the medal you lost, it's waiting for you. But even without wearing it, you are remembered." Nothing more, nothing needed. Eliza held the letter for a long time, then folded it carefully. She didn't need to prove anything anymore. And honor, she understood, didn't reside in glass cases or bronze plaques. It lived in the way a girl like Vega stood up and moved forward, steady and surviving. On another late afternoon, the sun cast its final rays through the training field's fence. Eliza stood behind a new recruit, gently adjusting their slim shoulders, repeating how to breathe while aiming. No need for many words. A single touch was enough to pass on steadfastness. The scar on her face caught the sunlight like a living memory. But this time, no one looked at it with pity. They saw a teacher, someone who had walked through fire and returned, not to recount battles, but to ensure others weren't consumed by them. When the day's last light touched Eliza's scar, we didn't just see a soldier once burned, but living proof of a simple truth. Strength doesn't need to shout to be recognized. Some people quietly carry their wounds, not to lament, but to turn them into a guiding light for others. Eliza's story isn't just about a misunderstood woman, but about the power of forgiveness, resilience, and how a heart can still beat for others, even after battle. If you've ever felt forgotten or judged by your exterior, remember, some values don't need to hang on a wall. They live through actions, through quiet kindness, and through the people you've inspired. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey. If this story touched you, leave a comment below. We read every single one. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share this video with those you believe need a light, even a small one, in their day-to-day.